Ritwik Ghatak was an extraordinary man and an extraordinary filmmaker. He was a Bengali like Satyajit Ray. He was born in 1925 in Dhaka, and he died in the mid-70s in Calcutta. The reason he was extraordinary as a man was that he seemed to get all the students he taught, all the filmmakers he knew on his side immediately. They loved him, they admired him, and even though he was clearly an alcoholic, they seemed to try to protect him in every way. Quite astonishing how much affection. He almost was a legend in his lifetime, and he's certainly a legend now. The reason he was an extraordinary filmmaker was really the passion with which his films were made. They were sometimes overemphasized, sometimes melodramatic, sometimes unevenly edited, but there was an enormous power in the films which transcended everything else. Added to that, he tried all sorts of new techniques which had never been tried, at least in the Indian cinema before, like the use of natural sound. He was a man whom so many people admired, both for himself and for his films, that I don't think there's anybody quite like him in the Indian cinema, at least over the last 50 years. He actually started off in the theatre, in the Indian People's Theatre. He was a Marxist, and the People's Theatre was communist. And he translated Brechtian plays. He actually performed sometimes, but he certainly produced those plays. But he thought in the end that he wasn't getting to enough people that way, and he wanted to say something. And what he actually wanted to say was how terrible the whole partition process was. Partition, if you remember, wrecked Bengal. Bengal was split into two, and he was a Bengali, and he felt that the cultural traditions of his own land had been completely destroyed, and that the bourgeoisie had actually done this to themselves as much as the British, that it was really the fault of the Indians themselves that this terrible thing happened. It made refugees of hundreds of thousands of people, and practically everybody in his films is a refugee and is a member of the bourgeois class who were actually complicit in the partition process. He hated partition. His two influences, really, were Eisenstein, the Russian filmmaker, him being a communist, at one time at any rate, and Tagore. Tagore was the great Bengali writer and poet, and shot through all his films were the kind of arguments that Eisenstein might have put forward visually, and that Tagore put forward in other ways. He wasn't influenced like Ray by Hollywood or by Renoir. He wasn't influenced by the French New Wave. He had one thing that was very much like Jean-Luc Godard. Jean-Luc Godard was obsessed by the Vietnam War. Ghatak was obsessed by partition. The Cloud-Capped Star was made in 1960, and it was inspired by Ghatak actually looking at a bus stop where there was a worn-looking young woman. He thought that this woman was typical of hundreds of thousands of Bengali women, refugees, living a very impoverished life, but not completely impoverished, but trying to keep the family together. And his heroine in the film is this girl, the girl he saw at the bus stop. She is trying to keep the family together. The father is a teacher. The mother wants her to get married, but she can't get married because family responsibilities are so difficult. She has a brother who's an idler. He wants to be a singer, but he doesn't seem to be able to get a job. She has a younger sister who's prettier than her, and she has a lover. The lover is away, he's a student, and her plan is to marry him one day. She doesn't marry him, she can't marry him. There's too many responsibilities. She's got to keep the family together. And in the end, the student marries the younger sister. She gets tuberculosis, and we know she's going to die at the end. Well, Ghatak thought that this was a kind of a story which had been repeated millions of times in India, and particularly in Bengal during the partition era, when families were trying to keep themselves together, despite the fact that they were refugees from another area because of partition. Now, how did he make the film? Well, he made it in a very straightforward manner, in a way, but it was actually very complicated underneath. If you look at the sound, if you listen to the sound and the music, you'll find that it's quite different to any other Indian film that had been made, even Patha Panchali, which was made 5 years earlier. It's different because of the natural sound, the birds, the noise in the courtyard, the cooking on the oven, and also, at salient moments, the crack of a whip, which is one of the most extraordinary dramatic devices in the film. Above all, it's really about the character of an Indian family at that time. Desperation is there for everyone to see, but they carry on somehow. They've got not much money, they've got not much hope, and who keeps them all together? This young girl, the epitome of Indian womanhood, Ghatak. It's extraordinarily well acted, it's extraordinarily well shot, and of course the sound is quite exceptional. So people think it's his masterpiece. It certainly is one of the most extraordinary Indian films I've ever seen. It's rather like a neorealist film, but underneath that is an awful lot of other things which we don't understand as Westerners, at least I don't understand fully, but about Indian culture and about the centuries-old culture which is being gradually destroyed by the effects of partition. Partition was, Ghatak thought, the fault of the very people we see in the film who didn't care enough to do anything about it. And so there's a very political tinge to the film. There's obviously a very social tinge to the film, and there's also a lot of cultural things going on in the background. But principally, it's a very simple story about a family trying to keep together and the person who tries to keep them together. And the more she does so, the more her own life becomes desperate and lonely and hopeless. Made with so much passion, made also with humour, and made with the kind of accuracy that is almost reflected by Ghatak himself looking at that bus stop, seeing that girl, that weary girl by the bus stop with the bag of groceries under her arm. And that girl was the heroine of his film.